the individual wishes to make a serious study of various parts of the Bible or of the whole work, according to conditions and inclinations dictate. This evening we're going to depart a little from the previous outline because we are going to examine certain sections from the first Book of Kings in more detail, particularly those parts that relate to the building of Solomon's temple. If we intend to use this material, consider it important enough for discussion, we should try to give it as much orientation as we can in terms of the conditions under which it was compiled and the opinions and findings of those who were most directly associated with the production of this work, or with the language and the philosophy which it unfolds. The principal sources of Old Testament historical orientation are the books themselves and the writings of the historian Josephus. This Jewish historian was a man apparently of thorough mind and with a considerable scholarship. The historical records, so far as we have been able to verify them historically through time, have been essentially correct. And he seems to have had the capacity to organize history in a meaningful sequence, to present emphasis upon the significance of events rather than merely the chronicling of the occurrences themselves. He was much of the same spirit as distinguished H.G. Wells, the modern historian, who pointed out that the real purpose of history is to record the internal growth of man, not the passing adventures of empire. Josephus, with this mind and with this thinking, has given us some valuable information. Another principal and useful source of Old Testament tradition consists of the commentary and the legends and the lore, some parts of these being actually earlier than the written works themselves. We know that the entire thinking of Israel was not locked in the Pentateuch. These people had minds and thoughts and beliefs and ideas and visions, and that they were a living people. Therefore, they had a literature, they had a culture, they had creative art. They were advanced in many departments of human knowledge and aesthetic appreciation. So we are not surprised that they have left us a rich heritage of contemporary thought and also a considerable amount of later material bearing upon it. It's not possible in the time that we have to attempt to give you a full list of documentations of authorities. So, I think for those parts which are not actually canonical, you can say, use a well-known phrase, that these parts are of the mind of Israel, that they represent the thinking, the feelings, the beliefs. And as the old works themselves sometimes begin with the words, thus it is reported by our Father. This is the approach to a subject where naturally most historical landmarks are inadequate. The historical phase of the subject by no means exhaustive, and that point is one which we hope to develop a little later in the evening. For the moment, however, let us analyze the story as it is contained in the first 11 chapters of the first book of Kings. When David was called to his father, according to the will of the Lord, Solomon his son became king of Israel. Solomon was at that time 12 years of age, and his name was not Solomon. His name was given to him much later. His name was Jedediah, which means the friend of God. He was the son of David and Bathsheba. And he inherited a wealth of Israel. Not only the glory of David, but the burden of David. And we find frequently referred to in these early writings the sins of David and how these descended upon Solomon, and the sins of Solomon and how these descended upon Israel. But for our present moment, we are concerned with a young man who inherited a strange and peculiar caste, appointed to him not only by David his father, but by Samuel the prophet, the great teacher of Israel, the man who dared to reprimand David before the court of Israel. David has been likened to the character of King Arthur in the legendary and lore of Britain. During David's lifetime, the people of Israel were in almost constant warfare. It was the work of David to consolidate the great country, which was gradually coming into social and political existence. For the reign of David was a reign of war, that had tribulation and birth, the political peace in Israel. And therefore the great purpose and dream of David's life was not fulfilled. For he had dreamed of hopes and prayed that it might be to him given, that he might build the everlasting house of the eternal God in Israel. But this, according to the ancient prophets, the God of Israel did not thank him, but left it to his son to carry on this work of holiness. And one of the reasons, according to the ancient scholars, why this occurred was that while David was king of Israel, he built himself a house which took 15 years to build. But he did not have time to build the house of the Lord. The Lord was offended. Solomon, who followed after, was a rich and powerful king. But according to the commentary, he was favored before David, because he resolved first to build the house of the Lord, and after that to build all other things which were necessary. And in his early life, Solomon stood upon the plain of Gibeon, and while he stood upon that plain, he prayed unto the Lord of hosts. And the God of Israel appeared to him, and spoke to him, and said that of all those who were to come, only next to the Messiah should be the glory of Solomon. And that because of this glory, he ordered me to ask of the Lord any favor, any gift, any boon that he might desire. And Solomon, because even as a lad he was exceeding in wisdom and understanding, was quiet for a moment, and then he answered the Lord, and said to him, Great God of Israel, I ask only one thing, that thou shouldst give me wisdom of understanding, because if I have this, all other things that are necessary shall come unto me. And God was pleased with the reply of Israel to Solomon the king, and he bestowed upon Solomon the gift of wisdom. And it was this wisdom which was afterwards to distinguish his life. But because of certain things which he did were against the Lord, certain parts of his wisdom were later taken from him, but he remained to the end a wise and good ruler over his people. Now Solomon, realizing that it was his first duty from his father, David, that he should build the everlasting house, first then resolved to form a partnership with a neighboring ruler with whom he was very friendly. And this was Hiram, king of Tyre. And Hiram was a very learned and wonderful man. And there are still in existence in the ancient Jewish writings copies of letters between Solomon and the king of Tyre. And these letters were principally from the level of philosophy, and these asked the others, strange questions and sought the answer. And each tried to be more complete and more perfect in the answer than the other. But there was a real and great friendship between these two men. And so it was that Hiram of Tyre sought Solomon to that he might have some share in the building of the temple. And Solomon was inclined to consider this, for the reason of why it was great wealth. He lacked certain raw materials and necessary things. He also lacked skilled workmen, for the people of Israel were not skilled in architecture. So he sent to Hiram and asked him to invoke the presence of the Ionian officers or builders, the great tribes of guildsmen, who had been concerned with the building of the great temples and monuments of antiquity. And Hiram besieged the sons of Solomon, 3,300 overseers of men, and those who were trained in all arts and crafts, so that all good things and beautiful things might be available for the completion of the everlasting house. And as the plans progressed, there were two thoughts in the mind of Solomon. One was derived from his father David. But David had told him, "My son, Israel is rich with gold and has been taken in captivity, and there's many precious and wonderful things which have been booty and loot from the army and for a military expedition. But it is not seemly that any of these should be used in the building of the everlasting house, which would not be right or good before God. But these things which have been taken in strife should be used for the adoration of God." Therefore, David admonished Solomon that he was to use only such wealth, such means, as had come from the people themselves, have been given freely, or have been gathered by regular means, so that there could at no time be any stigma upon the treasures of the house, and that they would never be seen or thought of, or believed, or known, as having been gained by violence or destruction. So Solomon was very careful in this, and he was able to fulfill this task with the great wealth that he gained through his own ingenuity and various means. One of his methods of attaining this wealth was through his practice with the king of Tyre, for Tyre was a merchant field before, and Solomon equipped ships and engaged in trade and barter and exchange throughout the lands of the Near East. The men of Israel were not sailors, nor were they used to the sea. So Hiram of Tyre supplied the Syrian navigators, and they shared the profits of these great expeditions which led them into many parts of the world. And from such sources as these, Solomon gained the treasures necessary for the building of the everlasting house, and did not forced to call upon any soil of battle for the ornamentation or the decoration of the house. The second thing that concerned him most deeply was of his own project. For he desired to build his house in the place which the Lord of hosts had designated, but he did not know where God wished him to build the temple. So again he entered into great prayer, and he went and fasted, and he meditated for many days, and he besought the Lord to show him the place upon which the house should stand. And the Lord of Israel came to him, and led him by the hand, and told him to go to a certain place upon Mount Zion. And when he went to this place upon Mount Zion, he came to a piece of land which was owned by two brothers. And this land was their threshing floor, where they brought their grain. Now these two brothers were very dear and near to each other, but were strangely different of their circumstances. One brother was a bachelor and very poor, and he had no means of livelihood except his share of the grain, which was stretched upon the threshing floor and placed in two heaps equally, one half for each brother. His brother was a rich and powerful man and had a large family and many children. And he also took his part of the grain largely because it was his by right. Now in the dark of the night, the Lord told Solomon to go to the threshing floor of the Jebusites, and there in the silence of the night to wait, and behold the wondrous workings of the Lord. So Solomon went and stood there in the shade of a tree where he could not be seen. And in the moonlight he saw the poor bachelor brother go out of his house in silence and in quietude, and without letting anyone know. And he went to his heap of grain, and he took a large part of that heap of grain, and he carried it over and sprinkled it upon his brother's pile. and he did it so carefully that it was not noticeable. Yet he had given away a large part of his grain. And he did this because he was a bachelor. And although he was poor, his brother had many children, and therefore he felt that his brother needed more than an equal share. And Solomon watched and was deeply moved by this wonderful example of brotherly love, and he kept quiet and waited as the Lord had instructed him. And after this brother had departed, the other rich and wealthy and happy brother came. And he looked for a moment for the pile. Then he went to his own pile, and he took a large part of the grain off and put it upon the pile of his poor brother. And he did this because, although he was rich and had many children, he did not want to offend his brother with charity. But he wanted his brother to have more than an equal share, because his brother was poor and had no other way of making a living. And neither wanted the other to know of the charity, lest it would offend them. And when Solomon the king saw this, he bowed his head in recognition to God, and he said, "Here, on the place which is the sign of kinship, of two unselfish brothers, each giving secretly of himself for the good of the other, I shall build the everlasting house." And thus it came that the rock Moriah was the ancient threshing floor of the Jebusites, where they had divided the grain when they come at night, to give each more than his proper share. And when Solomon saw this, he realized that God had blessed his birthright, and he proclaimed to the people the blessing of God was present in the service of these two, and it was a proper and appropriate symbol of a sanctified place set aside for the highest and the noblest of human condition. And so here Solomon built his everlasting house. Now the story of the building of Solomon's temple is very largely a description of the methods and means of the erection, the designing of it, the departments into which it was divided, the size, and all the other circumstances. And we know that the Ionian workmen that were sent by Hiram of Tyre labored long and diligently upon this work, and the masters of this group designed the wonderful fittings of all of us to the temple. And Solomon sent many workmen, and hewers of wood and carriers of water, to the cedars of Lebanon, and he cut down the great cedars to become the beams and spans of the everlasting earth. Now these cedars of Lebanon were very wonderful trees, and they were taken to Joppa and floated, and there they were brought to Jerusalem and placed in the building. Now the ancient rabbins tell us, and of course in Israel what they tell us must be true. That is the way that people feel about it. But after these cedars had been placed in the temple, they did not die, but because of the strange power of that peculiar wood, they grew after they had been put in place, and they burst forth into branches, and they turned trees, and they were made alive and filled with life by the incense smoke arising from the altars of offering. And these strange trees bore strange fruit which was not of their kind. And the young priests of the temple, in great tribulation of time and in famine, were fed by the fruit that grew from the pillars of Lebanon that were in the everlasting house. Now the temple of Solomon, according to the story, took 7 years to build. And during these 7 years, many strange and wonderful things happened. During these years, not one workman sickened or died. During these years, not one instrument of the workman was dulled or broken or worn. During these 7 years of the work, there was no discord among all these workmen. They labored together in peace, and happiness and tranquility was upon the place, and no one sickened and no one died in the building of the everlasting house. And when finally at the end of 7 years the house was finished, Solomon was told by the Lord that he must not open the house upon that day, the day of its completion, but that he must wait, because the dedication of the temple must occur in the month of the birth of Abraham. So nearly a year passed before the coming of the day of the great dedication of the temple. And when that day came, Solomon went toward the place of the Holy of Holies, and upon the doors of the Holy of Holies were the brazen figures of the cherubim, guarding forever the sacred place. And as Solomon approached the doors of the Holy of Holies, the doors closed in his face. And it was a strange and mysterious thing, because the doors could not be opened. And in this time, and on this occasion, Solomon knelt in prayer before the gates of the Holy of Holies. And he besought the Lord to open the gates, and they remained closed. And he prayed in many ways for the opening of these doors, but they were not opened until the Lord whispered in his ear the thing that he would say. And Solomon raised his hands to the Lord, and he said, Lord, in this day of the great rejoicing, remember now the worthy work of thy son David, who came before the king of Israel. And at the word David, the doors opened, and the great prophets and priests bowed their heads, because they knew that at that moment the divine will had forgiven the sins of David. So there are strange and wonderful stories about the story of the everlasting God. And in the completion of this work, which Solomon had done according to the law of his father, there was a change. Suddenly the workmen began to grow old, and their tools broke, and they could not use them again. And many of them died. But the master of the work, a man of Tyre, who had been brought by Hiram to make all of the great instruments for the temple, a man by the name of Hiram, who was the son of a widow. According to the ancient writings, he and he alone, of all the workmen, was permitted to enter heaven without death. For he was taken up among those who did not die, and placed with the Lord for 1,000 years. And of the others, they scattered, but none of them ever built again, because they could not build another house after having built the home, the abode or temple of the living God. And into the temple of Solomon were brought the wonderful and sacred objects, all the replicas of them, or new representations of them, which have been in the tabernacle in the wilderness. And it was an ancestor of Hiram, the master builder, who had fashioned the furniture of the tabernacle. So that this particular and wonderful task is set into this family. And having completed the temple according to the will of heaven, and having kept promise he made to David, Solomon then built his own throne, a magnificent throne of lion. And he built a home for his queen, who was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he built many wonderful buildings, and scientific buildings, and colleges and schools for the instruction of his people. And after he had completed this tremendous project, with mysterious visits came from Baltus, the queen of Saba, that we call the queen of Sheba. And Baltus of Saba is the wisest woman in the world, and she had heard of the wisdom of Solomon. So she came to test the wisdom of Solomon. And there are many wonderful and interesting stories of the wonderful program that these two devised to investigate the mysteries of the universe and of time and of eternity, of all strange things. But it's a very simple and interesting little legend that comes from that time, which is amusing. Each tested the other. Baltus tested Solomon, and Solomon tested Baltus, concerning their ability to judge and decide and determine the truth of things. And on one occasion, the queen of Saba brought into the presence of Solomon 2 magnificent baskets of flowers, so identical that no human being could tell them apart, and so perfect that no way could be told, no way could be seen to distinguish them. And the queen told Solomon, "May not touch these, you may only look upon them. You shall tell me which of these baskets is filled with living flowers,
tricky question. And then he told one of his courtiers, he said, open the windows of the palace. And they opened the windows of the palace, and Eve came in. And Eve immediately went to the living God. It could not be Eve. And thus it was that Solomon was able to solve the riddle of houses. So there are many such wonderful and strange accounts through all this story. And there is another, which is peculiarly of interest to us at the present time. After ruling for 40 years over Israel, Solomon was gathered also unto his father, and his son ruled in his place. And the golden age of Israel gradually but inevitably came to a close. Now let us go back and study another very interesting thing. You must remember that a very large part of the literature of Israel was never reduced to words. It was carried in the form of oral tradition. And the word in Hebrew, which covers the thought, oral tradition, is Kabbalah, which can literally and factually mean the unwritten. Now, oral tradition is inevitable in many parts of the world. Our American Indians never had any other tradition of the oral. And yet they preserved a strange and wonderful record of the essential principles of their culture. There was an oral tradition also in Israel, dealing with matters that were too deep or too mysterious, or had come from such antiquity, that the extremely limited language of the country, and particularly its written form, was not sufficient. We sometimes wonder why the old Jewish people gesticulate so dramatically in connection with conversation. That is rather simple. They had to. It has come down in their bloodstream since the beginning, because their language only contained about a half enough words to express their meaning. The rest they had to fill in with gestures and with motions of their hands and various ways of indicating, very much as small children do today. Instead of trying to tell you a thing at a certain height, they spread their hands and show you the size of the object. It is much clearer, especially in these old days, when the written forms were most inadequate. But the oral tradition in Israel centers around a number of very interesting things. It is perpetuated in what may be called the thought. And the thought is the assembly of the wise. And the thought represented that peculiar group of elders from whom these traditions were carried down century after century, generation after generation. And even after the diaspora and the scattering of Israel, the elders continued to keep the tradition. In fact, it is rather fortunate that the elders did, because the Torah, that is the Pentateuch, and many other parts of the Bible were 3 times destroyed during the period of biblical history. And had not these elders been able to restore it from their own knowledge, the work could not survive. But because they had this record, and because many of them could recite the entire Torah, if the few who survived were able to restore the work time after time. But in the oral tradition of these people, there are very interesting stories and legends, and we want to tell you about one of them tonight, because it ties in with Solomon. It ties in with a great many of the elements of the story of the temple and of the circumstances that led up to it. And this story begins really before man begins. And it is the story of a mysterious and strange book. Now, according to the word of the elders, there existed in the beginning, in the universe, in the mysterious depths of things, with God, a strange book. This book was written by the living servant of God. It is traced in the mysterious characters of from tablets of sapphire. This book shone with all the light of the world, and lighted heaven before the sun and moon were fashioned. It has never been named. There was no designation ever given to it. It's simply called the book. And this book was with God in the beginning, for it was the book that was peculiarly associated with the power of God. And at the time before the fall and the ancient legend, when Adam attended the University of angels in heaven. The angel Raphael brought down to Adam from God the book and placed it before him. He said to him, "Here is the book of the knowing of all things that may be known. And here is the book by which the name of the substance of things may be discovered, even the name of the cause of things, even the name of the meaning of things, even the name of heaven itself, the unutterable, mysterious, unpronounceable name, which is the root of all things." And this book was left with Adam for a time by the angel Raphael. But according to the old legend, the celestial beings who watched over these became envious of the power of the book, because it contained all things. One said to the other, "If Adam has this book and reads it all, he will know all the mysteries of the universe." This must not be. So they took the book away from him, and they cast it into the sea. There it remained. Adam went forth alone into the wilderness to search for the book. And while he was there, he prayed and fasted. The Spirit of God came to him, and Adam told how the book had been taken away. The Spirit of the Lord spoke and called upon Rahab, who was the angel of the sea, and told him to restore the book that he said. And when Adam died, the book was given to Shem. By Shem it was kept for the generations which were to come. And after a time, the book disappeared. No one could find it. And while this book was strangely and mysteriously missing, the God of Israel sent a good man into the earth, a man upon whom the gifts of God is prospered and knowing all things, which bestowed for the will of heaven. The name of this good man was Enoch. Enoch walked with the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him. The Lord appeared to him in a dream and told him to go to a certain cave. And if he was going to this cave, down under the earth, he would find there the mysterious book of God, written upon the tablets of sapphire. And Enoch found the book as he had been instructed. And from this he wrote the mysterious book of Enoch, in which he revealed the mysteries of heaven and earth. Now a great time was to pass before the story of this book was completed. It came about, the Lord, according to Israel, having discovered that the children of his creation had disobeyed him, resolved to send a deluge and a flood upon the earth. And he therefore called unto his beloved son Noah, and told him to prepare against the tribulation of the earth. And when he was so instructed, the Lord sent the book of Enoch, the mysterious book of books. And he placed it in the hands of Noah, and the messenger of the Lord on this occasion was the archangel Raphael. And this book was placed in the keeping of Noah. Noah was permitted to open certain pages of it, so he was able to discover upon those pages all the mysterious calculations necessary for the formation of God. And he followed the instructions which were in the book. When the waters came, Noah made a casket of gold, placed it around the book. He placed the book in the ark, and for 40 days and 40 nights there was darkness upon the face of the deep. And there was no sun, no moon, nor stars, and all was strange and great, obscure. But this mysterious book lighted the way of Noah. And in this book they shone as gold in the daytime, and as silver at night. And therefore Noah was able to know the number of the days and the number of the nights. He was able to know all things happening in the universe, although they were invisible because of the great oblivion that was upon the deep. And after Noah, the book passed to Abraham and to Jacob and to Isaac, and to all the great patriarchs, until finally it came into the hands of Solomon, the king of Israel. Now this Solomon, if we are to go a little bit afar to the legends of the Arabian Nights of all these things, was a man who had very strange knowledge from the Lord, and he also had a knowledge of things belonging to other worlds, and he was able to make strange and mysterious journeys the law of all. Solomon had an eagle which carried him about. He had many mysterious and wonderful inventions which enabled him to fly, pass through the air, perform wondrous miracles. Many of the traces of these legends are found in the Arabic language, which he was most by the Catholic study of the complete and utter excavation of the Arabian Nights. And this mysterious book was buried by Solomon and was hidden away that the world might not find it. But the old ones, the elders, maintained that from the beginning of the world there had been not only the Torah, which was the revealed law, but there had been a hidden law, which was truly the secret doctrine of Israel. And that this hidden law was the key to the law and the prophets. And that only by the turning of these keys 7 times to the great rock could the mysteries of the Shekinah glory and the Kabbalah of the law be made known. One of the earliest examples of this conception or this belief is in connection with the Proverbs of Solomon. For the ancient rabbinical writers calculated these proverbs as 3 times the number of the editions they published. The answer being that each one contains 2 others, and that each proverb was therefore 3 complete works if the individual knew how to interpret its meaning. The mysticism of Israel passed through many phases, and the contemporary records of it are mostly in the making, although certain of the old prophetic writings definitely have changed faces related to it. And that very much, however, is been put together. The story of this particular in any complete pattern further back than about 6th or 7th century BC. But as this period coincides very closely with the final surviving manuscript of the Old Testament, we may assume that the situation did not originate at that time, because all the foundations and footings of these things are of much greater antiquity. Legends going back 12 or 1500 years before the beginning of the Christian era certainly contain intimations like that of the mysterious Book of the Law. The intimations that these people held it to be definitely and inevitably true, that they did possess a key or a secret answer, a secret solution to the mysteries of their life. This thought is certainly preserved even today in Christendom, in the insignia and crest of the popes of Rome. The papal crest, of course, is the triple tiara, surmounting the cross peak. One of these keys is silver, and the other key is gold. And it has been the mind of the church, in fact, the actual leaders of the church, for a great many centuries. But the silver key represented the key which unlocked the Kabbalah of the Old Testament. And the golden key, the key which unlocked the Kabbalah of the New Testament. This statement, and one identical in meaning with it without equivocation, is to be found in the early religious writings of the church. They assume and accept that without any reasonable recognition. So in the Jewish tradition, the silver key of the Kabbalah plays quite an important part in the descent of this tradition. As I mentioned to you before, there was a report that Moses descended Sinai 3 times. The first time for 40 days, the first time the Torah was given. The second time for 40 days when the Mishnah was given. And the third time for 40 days when the Kabbalah was given. But Moses was forbidden to place the Kabbalah in writing. Therefore, for many centuries, it was perpetuated only by the high priest. Only one at a time was supposed to possess the mysterious key that unlocked all of the scriptures, all of the allegories, all of the symbolism of the entire religious system. We are confronted with the same problem in certain of the Brahmatic priests of India. Among them, certain ones carry a key as a symbol of their authority. The Egyptian pharaoh, as ruler of the mysteries, carried the key around his neck in state ceremony. His key was the great Samsaka, which opens sanctuary. What's the key as a part in the symbolism? very old and very rich. The decline of Jewish culture resulting in and resulting from, to a certain degree, the domination by the Roman Empire, resulted gradually in the disintegration of the internal structure of Judaism. It disintegrated in a collective pattern and became more and more completely a problem of survival in the individual believer. The individual believer took his faith with him wherever he went. He worshipped alone, he believed alone, he meditated alone. And to a certain degree, the Christianism resulted in a tremendous frustration, and a tremendous pressure that affected his spirit. Those of you who years ago were in Jerusalem before the liberation of Israel, and the first lamentation to the wall of Herod's temple will appreciate the cry of Israel which rose for 25 centuries. This cry of Israel was strangely associated with the rise of a very positive mysticism within these people. They turned more and more within themselves in search of truth, in search of salvation, consolation of spirit, security of life. So we are not surprised that as the early Roman persecutions began to affect Israel, that the mystical dimensions of their doctrine were revived. And probably one of the greatest leaders in this revival was the Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who flourished about the beginning of this year, slightly earlier, and restored or gathered all of the great legendary, all of the great lore, all of the fading memories of his people, to restore as far as he could their concept of life. And he is accredited with having created a work called the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of the Beginnings. This does not constitute an historical work. The Sefer Yetzirah is actually the story of Jewish philosophy. It is the story of the concept of creation and of the organization and generation of worlds which underlies the Mosaic theory. And Rabbi Akiva also was one of the first to introduce a complete system of philosophy among his people, dependent entirely upon letters and numerical equivalents. He therefore suddenly gave to the ancient works a new and powerful interpretation. He admonished against the changing of the spelling of names and things of that kind, an admonition which again occurs in the Book of Revelation. And he warned these people that even the sounds of the sacred words were valuable and important and meaningful. But particularly, he developed a system of philosophy by creating analogies between the letters of the Hebraic alphabet and the elements, dimensions, directions, powers, and forces of nature. He was able, therefore, to use letters to spell out living things. There are many legends about Rabbi Akiva, some of which are no doubt apocryphal, and others are no doubt efforts to symbolize his meaning or explain the thing that he himself was trying to explain. For example, Rabbi Akiva could take letters. For instance, he could take the letters of the word for dove, and he took the letters and he fastened them completely and put them together in a magical way, and they came to life and flew away like the dove. Because everything that the Rabbi Akiva did with letters became that thing. When Akiva made a house out of letters, the house was there. When Rabbi Akiva made a bird, spelled the name of the bird and breathed upon it, the bird flew. Because he fastened the letters, not in the traditional way, but in a magical way, so that every letter formed a line, and every line contributed to a certain pattern. And when the pattern was perfect, it was no longer a symbol, it was the thing itself, and it came to life. So the Rabbi Akiva could take the words of the Bible, the words of Scripture, and they came to life. He could take the name of God, and it came to life, and became a radiant, living, and eternal thing. And everything that our people fashioned out of number of the letters became immortal forever. It's a very strange series of legends. There are certain indications that this parallel may have been partly due to the earlier experiences during the 5th and 6th centuries in which Jewish scholars became acquainted with the early development of Greek mathematics. We know that between the 3rd and 6th centuries, Greek scholars visited Jerusalem, and also the Jewish scholars visited Athens, and became associated with the philosophical systems there. And there is much in the thinking of Akiva that indicates the genesis of Pythagoras. On one occasion, Pythagoras told his disciples, for example, that his own name was a Kabbalah, and that anyone who could solve the mystery of the name Pythagoras alone could solve the mystery of the universe, because that was not his real name. And so it was with Akiva. Akiva would let no man know his name, because he said the man who knew his name would control him forever, because every man has a secret name. And if that name comes into the power of another, that control passes with it. Now, out of these distinctions, we dimly perceive the rising of what might be termed a transcendental magic. We see the Jewish mind, under the frustration and pressure of great affliction, becoming almost violently mystical. We see its speculations extending far beyond what might be immediately considered reasonable. And because of this, there was a great revulsion in the Sanhedrin, and there was a great division among the people. And in this particular situation, there is one point that I think that may need a little clarification. And it's really the rather usually the least use of the term in the New Testament. A great many persons have come to rather mistaken ideas about the Pharisees among the Jews. We think now of the scribes and Pharisees as being more or less arrogant, opinionated group of people. Well, they may have been or they may not have been, I don't know. But actually, from Josephus and some other reputable historians, we find that most of the mysticism of Israel descended through the Pharisees. In other words, the Pharisees were the sect at that time that believed in the incarnation and the only one that did. The Pharisees were the ones who were then looking for a Messiah. The Pharisees were the ones who would have become scholars and students in these subjects, and also were the ones who had had contact with the Greeks and other people, and were bringing in a great many innovations into the life of the Jewish people. The Pharisees were also toying with a great deal of philosophy derived in contact with the Jews, because in the Solomonic cycle, we have learned definitely that King Solomon received gifts and various tokens of esteem from the kings of High Asia, and that many of the decorations used in his temple were based upon the decorations which were sent as gifts from India. Solomon was definitely known historically to have been in contact with the Far East. And this is not amazing when we realize that Paul of Saba, the king, came to what is now Yemen, which is only just almost on the boundaries of Afghanistan, and only across the Kashmir from what we now call India and Pakistan. So the mysticism of that time was beginning to take rather broad proportions. About the time of Akiva, shortly later, another man arose who we have also mentioned to you, but we'll have to come back to him for a moment because he played a part in things. And that was Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. Rabbi Simeon is also a very elusive person. He is of about the same density as most of those involved in the adept tradition. He is very difficult to isolate historically, and nearly all that we know about him, as is the case also in so many scriptural accounts, is what he said about himself. Apparently during the reign of Vespasian, Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai was persecuted because he preached the right to Jewish people to perpetuate their religion and philosophy. He was accused of sedition, of endangering the peace, and a price was placed upon his head. To escape his enemies, Rabbi Simeon went into the desert, and there he found a cave, and with a small group of faithful followers, he remained in this cave for the entire duration of the reign at that station. They had no clothing, and when they were cold, they had to cover their bodies with earth. They had only the poorest of food, and very little power or means of securing anything, because they did not dare to reveal their presence. A few faithful persons brought them things, but according to the story itself, the Lord fed them, even as he had fed the children with manna and meat. And then he remained for so many years in prayer and meditation and holy life and in austerity in the cave. Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai had lived so great and pious and wonderful life that the living God brought to him or permitted him to look upon the mysterious book, the sapphire tablet. And the book which had been hidden from the destruction of the temple. The book was not found in the second temple and was not known to exist during the diaspora, was revealed in all its shining glory to Rabbi Simeon in the cave. Now it's possible that the story, even though we may regard it as apocryphal, had a part to play in the rise of Islam, because the story parallels almost exactly the story of the illumination of Muhammad. As you remember, Muhammad, a merchant of Mecca, a good man, pious, but was horrified because of his own internal integrity by the degradation of the city in which he lived. Mecca was a sacred city belonging to an old faith, the faith of the Octavian Star worship. But it had declined and decayed until it was nothing but a place of merchants and thieves to rob pilgrims who came there in faith and belief. And the soul of Muhammad was offended, and he prayed that some way might be found for him to cleanse Mecca. And Muhammad, as a man, never had any ambitions outside or beyond Arabia, and his principal ambition was the cleansing and the purification of his own city. At that time he was married to a very good and wonderful woman, Khadijah, who was much his elder, and was married him because he had made such a success of keeping her house and guarding her caravan. And Muhammad explained the mystery of soul to Khadijah. And she told him the only thing that he could do was take it in prayer and receive within himself the answer. And Muhammad did this very slowly. And in the course of his prayers, he went away into the mountains. And he found the mountain with a cave in it. And into this cave he went. The mountain was called Nirvana, which means the mountain of the light. And here, in prayer and meditation, fasting, and self-abnegation, Muhammad asked that the primitive and original religion of mankind, pure as it had been the days of the patriarchs and the prophets, might be again revealed to the world. At that time, the angel Raziel, or as some say, the angel Gabriel, appeared to him and showed him the writings or sealers of the Torah upon a scroll of silk. Now, in the case of Simeon ben Yochai, in this case, the mysterious words were shown upon this living stone, this strange and glittering sapphire, which seemed to be alive when there was constant fire within itself. And in this fire the letters stood out. And in his mysteries and in his chances, Rabbi Simeon compiled the books of the greater and the lesser holy assemblies, the books of the lesser and the greater faiths, and all the strange commentaries and allusions which go together to make the Zohar, the book of the splendors of the Lord. Now, the fate of this book is very mysterious, because like the original tablets of sapphire, it disappeared. Disappeared so completely that most rabbinical scholars today declare that neither the book nor the supposed author ever existed. That this entire story is a legend and a fable, and that actually the Sefer Zohar was compiled much later during the period of the Jewish Renaissance in Spain, by one Rabbi Moses of Leon. The study of the book, however, in its intrinsic structure, makes such a statement highly impossible. I think we are far more likely to be faced with this situation. Namely, that the books of Simeon ben Yochai, like for that matter the Pentateuch and the entire Old Testament, was carried for centuries in the minds of certain persons. But due to the destruction of the book, and you must remember that in those days books were not numerous as they are now. One Jewish scholar figured that at the time of Solomon, there were probably not more than from 20 to 30 copies of the Pentateuch. This would make the book highly vulnerable to destruction. The burning of cities, the recapturing of people, the looting and destruction of their sacred belongings could very well make this book inaccessible, if not entirely extinct. In fact, still remains that there is no copy of the Jewish manuscript of the Old Testament earlier than the 9th century A.D. And that means that in all probability, most of the older manuscripts did perish because of the small number of them that existed. As the Roman conquest and the persecution of Rabbi Simeon is studied in this light, it is very possible that most of the Sefer HaZohar, which is the great scripture of the Kabbalah, did not descend through 12 or 1300 years in written form. Or if in written form at all, in only one or two carefully guarded and cherished manuscripts. Perhaps like those manuscripts that are supposed to have fallen into the keeping of Nostradamus from his ancestors, as a result of their carrying these books around with them from the time of the diaspora to the final settlement in Nevada. So the fact most likely is that Rabbi Moses of Leon either came into the possession of a very ancient manuscript, or else that he was able to gather together from the wise, from the Hashia, from the learned ones, from the scholars, this text, this story, and painstakingly prepared for ultimate publication. This publication did come best known to us in the Latin version, which was published by Baron Small of Rosenblatt, and of which we have the first edition in the library. This, the descent of the Sefer HaZohar, ties very closely with the concept of the old records and how they were protected and how they came down to it, out of the miseries and mysteries of the past. Now to consider then the three books which, according to the Kabbalists, are most important in the development of their literature. They call these the Sefer Yetzirah, or the book of the formation, the origin of the faith, particularly containing the mystery of the ultimate humility. Interesting things in the Sefer Yetzirah that are worth remembering. For instance, there is the angelic element, and the paradisical writing, and the letters and the characters used by Adam before the fall. All these things in these wonderful fragments form part of this curious, remarkable relic or fragment of antiquity. The second work, of course, is the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of the Letters. And most Kabbalists, strangely enough, include the third one that we would not expect to have been included. And that is what they call the Sefer HaBachalis, or what we call the Book of Revelation. These three, then, they consider to be the primary works relating to the secret doctrine as it is referred to the Bible. So the actual doctrine of the Kabbalah becomes interesting to us on a number of grounds. In the first place, we are concerned with the origin of such doctrines. We are also concerned with their orientation in world thought. We are concerned with the methods and probable authenticity of their perpetuation. contributing further knowledge or enlightenment, or assisting in the correction or emendation of material relating to the biblical time or to the various books of the Bible. We know that these writings originated from the same people and at the same time, and therefore that they have a basic utility and it should be given at least some consideration. The Kabbalah primarily divides into about 5 or 6 parts. We think of it as a single tradition. According to the oldest form, the Kabbalah consisted of 2 original divisions. The 5 books of the Pentateuch, or of the law, fall too short of being the complete septenary. Now, as I've also mentioned, the 6th and 7th books of Moses, as they are now available or supposedly under distribution, are actually only grimoires. That is, they are productions of magic originating in the Middle Ages. They are not actually genuine productions of Moses or of the period in which Moses lived. The same is true of the Keys of Solomon, a work of magic rulers. It is comparatively late and belongs with such works as the grimoires of Pepe, Honorius, or the religious writings of magic. The 6th and 7th books of Moses, according to the old tradition, were the 2 works which completed the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or completed the law. Now, the 5 books corresponded in the Mosaic belief to the first 5 days of creation. The 6th book was the 6th day, and the 7th book was the Sabbath. Now, the 6th book, according to the priesthood, was the Mishnah. The Mishnah having to do primarily with what might be termed Greek psychology, in the sense of being the study of man, the study of the internal workings of man as a moral, ethical, spiritual, and material being. The Mishnah, therefore, was the book which was beneath the vestment, as Maimonides says. The body is, the man wears a coat, which is the Torah. Beneath the coat is his body, which is the Mishnah, and within the body is the living soul, which is the Kabbalah. So the Mishnah corresponds with the 6th book, which is the body of man. And it is a transference of legality, of the law, from the level of jurisprudence to the level of biology. It is the motion of the laws governing the universe, from the stone tablets to the living constitution of the human being. Therefore, the Mishnah is the law in life, or the living law, rather than the law upon tables of stone. The Mishnah corresponding consequently to the 6th day, according to the old thinking, left the 7th day, which was the great Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was the day of the silence. The Sabbath was represented by the center, around which gathered the directions. In these cases, and under this symbolism, the 6 faces of the cube. And in the center was the rest, or the point of the new knot. And this great rest was, according to the doctrine of Israel, the spiritual experience of the Kabbalah. So the Kabbalah was that which gathered all the directions again into the center, which cast from the center all to the directions, creating a tremendous mystery of a motion in 2 directions at once, a motion by which all emptiness was filled, all fullness was empty, a motion in which all things move to their fulfillment, and at the same time move to their center. And this center is the great quiet, the eternal peace, for it turned upon the axis of the Shekinah glory. Thus, in the Kabbalah was the great peace, which was the Jubilee. In the same way, the Kabbalah became the symbol of the Messiah, which was the rest and the peace of all nations. By the same token, the Kabbalah became the symbol of the New Jerusalem, of the city which is to come, the city of the perfect fulfillment of the prophecies, the golden age, which is to bring with it the end of all strife, the mending of all ills, the overcoming of all doubt, and the world governed and ruled by the living presence of God, who is appointed and anointed ministers. So the Kabbalah represented all these things, but most of all, it represented the great rest or the silence, the center. As one of the early writers called it, it was the great equilibrium. Because of this statement that is contained in the Sefer HaZohar, unbalanced forces perish in the void, thus cast the kings of Edom and the giants of ancient days. So the Kabbalah was to Israel the great balance. It was a symbol of nothing too much nor too little, the perfect peace that fulfilled the law. For upon the seventh day the Lord rested, and on the Sabbath day, therefore, he set apart for the rest of men. And in Israel there can be no rest, so the history of Israel is fulfilled. Therefore, the great rest is the restoration of Israel, by which was arcanely intimated the fulfillment of all things necessary for the eternal good of man and the universe. The science of the Kabbalah then descended to the people from this concept of the great rest or the great peace. And there is much to indicate that there was an association here with some of the yogic teachings of the East. And that on a level of practical ritualism, ceremonialism, with magic and transcendental art, that the so-called great rest was meditation, the cultivation of the internal discipline of peace, the individual becoming receptive, becoming accepting of the Lord, entering into the quietude in which the God of Israel, for whose voice might be heard. Thus the Kabbalah was also the sanctum sanctorum. It was the Holy of Holies, the place where the architect received the mysterious tracings upon his vessel board from the finger of the living God. So to enter into the closet was used in ancient Israel to symbolize to enter into the Kabbalah. And those who enter into the closet and worship in secret, their God shall reward them openly. So the closet or the locked place, the hidden place, with both the heart and the doctrine. And by the strange and mysterious use of words, similar but not identical, it is possible to imply these various things by errors and by curiosities of spelling and structure. And I see our expertise by means of which these could be in an orderly and regular manner, not haphazardly, not to please us at one moment and to be defective another if it does not please, but invariably and inevitably to reveal the same machinery in the structure of the sentences, the words, and the numbers. The Kabbalah contains much more, however, than this approach, because we learn, for example, that Solomon, the king of Israel, is a great physician. We know less about this in the Jewish tradition and much more about it in the Arabic. But there are references to the mysterious power healing which Solomon had from the Lord. And there is probability that it is from Solomon that descended the concept or the belief of touching for king's evil, as is the great attraction to Europe, where it was believed that anyone who was touched by the king was cured of suffering. The touching for king's evil continued on down to the 18th century, and is still found in some Eastern countries. But the belief that the anointed of the Lord, the king, has certain powers as priest and physician certainly is to be found among the early records. So we are not surprised to find that the Kabbalah at a very remote time began the study of the human body. At that time, very little was known about the human body in the West, with the possible exception of Egypt, where dissection was permitted. It was not permitted in Greece. Therefore, it is probable that certain rudiments of knowledge concerning man was derived during the Egyptian and Babylonian captivities. But in the Kabbalah, we begin to see the development of a theory which was to dominate Europe for 1,500 years. And that was the great theory of the interchange of the microcosm and the macrocosm. We find this beginning to appear in written form as early as the Babylonian Enoch, because there are tablets in the British Museum now in which the great Hermetic axiom of as above, so below will be found attributed to the god Baal, or sometimes Marduk. This concept of the interchange between superiors and inferiors, this concept of the universe as a great person, and the person is the little universe, was already well advanced by the time the Jewish mystics took over the idea, but they did a great deal with it. For example, I have seen old Jewish manuscripts in Europe, in which there are 400 or 500 diagrams of nothing but the human heart alone, and not one of them anatomical. Every one of them magical, astronomical, mathematical, even going into music, and showing the different tones of the glowing of the sofa and its effects upon the nerves and muscles of the heart structure. The effect of the hundreds and hundreds of different prayers estimated in the pulse rate. All these things were perhaps the principal interest and activity of these people for a long time, because they were locked within themselves. They could not go out and mingle with other nations. They could not do the things that others did. And so we see them unfolding what they call the 21 powers of the sun through the human heart. We see them opening the 21 doors of the heart. We see them examining the flames, the powers therein. We find them examining the pulse point. We find them placing the solar system and the universe and the cosmic split system all in the heart. And then with these diagrams, we find the heart suddenly exploding into space to become the whole universe. And everything that relates to life is taking place within the great heart. These were their meditations and their speculations. And we might say that these are the foundations of what some have called the scientific Kabbalah. The scientific Kabbalah which relates to such problems. The discovery of the heart and the brain. The discovery of the brain in the heart. The discovery of the stomach in the liver. The discovery of the kidneys in the brain. The discovery of all parts in all parts. And we know now from the notebooks, records, diaries of Leonardo da Vinci, that he was concerned with this problem also. And that he had already received a considerable amount of lore about it as the result of the very liberal policies of Lorenzo di Mestre, who allowed a great number of Jewish scholars to become concerned with the great restoration of the Catholic cause. But the speculations relating to these things, relating to blood, relating to generation, relating to the methods and means by which propagation takes place, not visible but invisible. The great problem of magnetic fields, the problem of the internal life of the individual and his mysterious vestments which are similar to those of the priests of Israel, vestured in the glory of the Lord, upon whose robes were the tassels and bells, upon whose garments were the pomegranate. He wore an ephod, and also the bonnet of righteousness, and the great breastplate containing the jewels of the 12 tribes of Israel. And in this type of the Kabbalah, we see man being explored. We see how the infinite repetition of the parts of man, the pores of his skin, each muscle, each nerve, so that the entire problem is an infinite continuation or reproduction of the relationships of microcosm and macrocosm. How each little part contains all the rest, and how each great part is contained within a still greater whole. Thus, the practical phases of the Kabbalah went into medicine. They went into alchemy, and we find them highly developed. I've seen old Jewish prints showing the alchemical furnace as the human body, with all of the various alchemical processes taking place within it. These men were strangely learned in their own way, and they were working from a distinct and definite fact. They were not simply creating as they went. They were unfolding in one manner, perpetually integrated through everything that they did. Now, the next and perhaps one of the most interesting phases of the Kabbalah was the Kabbalah of state. This was the unfoldment of the implications of the Torah and the commentaries relating the government of nations. And in this phase of the Kabbalah, we see the human body again as empire. We see empire as a human body. We see the body and the empire as both of them symbolic projection of principles, or sephira, or the great, eternal, unchangeable archetypal jewels that lie at the root of every manifestation. And in the Kabbalah we learn, for example, much of the concept of archetypes. We learn, for example, that in the development of this doctrine, there is what is called reflection, not emanation. The Gnostics were the great emanationists. The Kabbalists were not primarily emanationists, they were reflectionists. In other words, to them, all things are reflections of their own superiors. Everything captures and holds the rays of the universe. Everything, therefore, like a photographic lens, contains a picture of everything else. And every energy bears not only its light print, but its purpose print, which it bestows upon the things which it illumines or vitalizes. So in the Kabbalah, we have the motion downward along what are called in the old writings the steps of Solomon's throne. Now in the old writing, we have the description of this throne. And we learn that it was a magnificent instrument that composed of many parts, and itself a microcosm of the universe with one difference, that instead of these parts merely being gold and silver figures, every creature upon the throne was alive. It was a living thing. And this throne, therefore, was a great symbol of the living universe itself. But the development of the concept of Kabbalah followed the steps and platforms of Solomon's throne. And on these steps and platforms, we see the symbolism unfolding. And in the Kabbalah space, we see the great concept represented on one level in the heart of man, bursting forth into the concept of world government. We find it all unfolding in terms of a magnificent pattern or plan, the natural development of the Torah. So the books of Moses become not only the legislative code of Israel, but they become the skeleton of a living body of Israel, in which not only do we have the law and the prophets, but we also have the development of a great political psychology. Most people believe that one of the great duties of man is to bring his own government to the complete harmony with the government of the universe. And this they attempted to do, at least in secret, through their teachings. We must remember that during these hundreds and hundreds of years, these people had no temporal power. Therefore, whatever they did was a speculative work within themselves. They were not like God. They were wanderers, they were not even citizens, they had no temporal rights, and they were pursued from one country to another. But even in this scattering of the tribes, the concept of a great government based upon the primary radiations of eternal energy grows. This concept is already growing and developing within them. Now the next phase of their work is what this thing termed the ceremonial Kabbalah. And the ceremonial Kabbalah deals primarily with the rituals of religion. And the concept of the Torah uses the formalities set by the priesthood according to the law of Moses. These forms could not be varied and duplicable. They had to be preserved exactly as form, as symbols and ceremonies. For to depart from the form of the symbol was to betray Israel with the ancient law, but no man knew why. Your Kabbalah took hold of this problem with a very simple and direct statement, that all of these rituals and symbols had a meaning, and that it was the meaning and not the form that it was intended to perpetuate. Therefore, the formality was only a reminder of the meaning.
even as words are only reminders of the ideas which are held within them. Therefore, that real and true religion had nothing to do with the physical formulas, except that these formulas were mysteriously symbols of something that was alive. The rituals and formulas were not themselves visibly and physically alive, but they concealed a living essence. They concealed a great power to the one who understood that. And this power was held in the concept of the ceremonial Kabbalah. The purpose of this Kabbalah being simply the illumination of the truth seeker, the attainment of identification with this great pattern of reality. So we have ways of looking at these things, and the old Jewish writers have thoughts about them themselves. Now you have, as we have pointed out before, a very interesting situation with Jewish philosophy that we do not have in any other situation of its kind. The Jewish religion is probably the most completely collectivistic faith that there is. And as I have mentioned in a previous lecture, the statement of the substance of it is as follows. There is no salvation for the Jew. There is salvation only for Israel. Now this is a very, very important thing. In the Jewish mind, the salvation of self, apart from the rest, has very little attraction. And now in modern times, there is some breaking away from this. But in the old day, there was this tremendous bond between the individual and the group. Now back in the days when the Kabbalah was being formed and fashioned, this concept was strong. And when we say, therefore, that the purpose of the ceremonial of religious Kabbalah was illumination, we know completely and definitely that the old scholar did not imply, or wish to have it imply, that this illumination was something selfishly for himself. Because his entire structure of faith made this impossible. Illumination for him, therefore, could only be like salvation for himself. It could only mean the preservation or salvation or the illumination of Israel. It could not mean himself as a person. Anything that happened to him, any light that came into his life, any spiritual content that was awakened within his soul, was awakened not for his use, not for his benefit, but for the good of Israel. And in reading back over the writings of the great rabbis over many hundreds of years, this is an inflexible rule. Namely, that the truly religious person, seeking to improve in any way, in virtue, in grace, in wisdom, in understanding, can have no motive other than the enlightenment of Israel. None of these things can do him any good, because there is no salvation for him apart from the salvation of Israel. Therefore, his works must be always for the common good, for through the common good he assures his own salvation. This is a complete reversal of many popular attitudes. Many have taken the attitude that if they took care of themselves first, then they could in leisure help others. Or they feel that by their own enlightenment they can achieve certain useful ends. Also, they believe that if the state becomes wise, it will save the people. This is not the viewpoint of the old Jew. His statement was that there is only one salvation, and that is the salvation of the whole. That the whole is first, not last. And that the individual is part of the totality. And this was based upon his own basic concept of God. Because in the deeper mysteries of God, deity, as unsoter, was this absolute totality.
ceremonial religion of these people, there is this definite note of searching for light, searching for inner understanding, but always what is right. Always that the Jew may understand Israel. One of the old rabbis said in one of his works, it is of no importance whether we are understood or not. All things are measured by what we understand. We may be misjudged by 1,000. This means nothing. But if we misjudge one, it is a disaster. That was the goal. So in this concept of totality, we find the rise of their ceremonialism. And we also find the key to their concept of Israel, which obviously, as we find in the Kabbalah, in its mysterious form, when all the parts of the universe are fitted together, when all the numbers are added together, when all things have been a time and a half time brought into the present. Out of all the words, out of all the 72 names of the great deity, out of the 72 powers of the archangel, out of the great name, Shemham Korash, comes, out of all these coming together into one pattern, places the single word, Israel. It is the totality of the totality. It does not relate primarily to the people of all. But for those who saw it from the veil, it was enough. That Israel symbolized the world. Now this caused the old Jew also to come to the conclusion that in some mysterious way within his own faith, and this is a highly controversial issue, but I think we must be fair to it. And that is that in some way he felt back through those times that in something, if Israel could be true, and we find this in his writings, if Israel can be true to Israel, the whole world of the Gentile is redeemed. In other words, in one of the old rabbinical commentaries, it says that God created many people. And that if one people kept the law, God would forgive the rest in their name. And it is a curious thing that this recurs so frequently in the study of ceremonial thought. Now, another phase of the matter, which I think also has to be considered, and that is that in the times of the ancient Jews, sciences were not as far evolved as they are now. We do not have a great deal of record in the outward working of things concerning the scientific knowledge of that period among those people, because they were more or less isolated from the great centers of learning, and they were more or less wound up and not locked into their own way of life. But through the Kabbalah, we see that a great scientific concept was dawning among these people. We can trace it without a break for over 2,000 years. And we know from the condition in which we find it that it could not have reached that condition except by a great deal of early immaturity. So it appears that, again, the prophets, those who walked with God and who received the anointing of oil after the order of Melchizedek, were in some ways intuitively aware or inspirationally conscious of great principles of science, mathematics, of art, music, literature, and other subjects that we do not too well comprehend today. So we have among them the rudiments of the great sciences of cosmogony and the beginnings of the concepts of anthropology. The concept of cosmogony is a magnificent expansion in many directions and dimensions of space around the plane of the opening chapters of Genesis. But whereas this appears to be almost merely an outline to refresh the memory, the commentaries and the work of the old Kabbalists expands their researches into this subject into thousands of times the length of the original. And in this concept we find a no reason to doubt it, because the words do occur, although sometimes without a very clear translation in the more familiar writings. But the words are there. And these words have to do, as the Kabbalah tells us, with the dawn of things, the formation of things from their own roots. Very little is available other than Noah von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denodata to give us a clue to these concepts. In years past, in working with this subject, I have had the privilege of discussing it with several learned European rabbis. The rabbis in this country are certainly mostly not in a position to put it much. You have to go to the old rabbinical groups that flourished or survived or struggled through in areas like Czechoslovakia or Poland, or one of these areas in which, in their desperate defense, they have held very tightly to all of the things which they believed and knew. I was talking to one old rabbi whose father before him had been a rabbi, and whose father before him had been a great priest of the faith in Europe. And he told me that he had seen in his grandfather's library, when he was a very small boy, he couldn't remember much anymore, he had seen priceless scrolls that had belonged in the family for centuries. He said that some of these scrolls, made of parchment, carefully put together, were more than 1.5 feet wide and over 200 feet in length. Every part of their surfaces was neatly covered with diagrams, with figures, and symbols. All of these symbols connected from the beginning to the end, with a thread through them like a thread through a string of beads. But these diagrams have been studied by a few older rabbis, but the younger ones were afraid of them, believing that they might be works of the devil. But these ancient manuscripts, Lord knows whether they have survived the struggles in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Germany in the last 20 years, we do not know. But these old manuscripts and records still exist. And they were records that represented a very careful and thoughtful development. As one of the older manuscripts says at the beginning, this is the writing about the least of things, and the that which grows from the least, and the that which bears witness from the growth, and that which bears fruit from the witness. I remember that old statement at the beginning of all the manuscripts. These things are very interesting, and I think we cannot hope to go into them this evening in anything resembling an orderly way, but I do believe that they contribute one thing for us, and that is a certain thoughtfulness. I think they will make us perhaps a little more considerate, a little more gentle, a little more observing, a little more inclined to think about the possibilities of these secrets locked with the silver key, because they are part of the religions that we have seen. Try to justify the adaptations that we have made. Now, in this problem of the Kabbalah, we know that the original concept began always with one point. And this point was called Ain. A-I-N, or A-Y-N. Now, the word itself is a wonderful word, because it says, when you break it down, it's something like this: I am a word. And the I am the word that can never be a word. When you see me, you see nothing. And I am only a word because through this word, or through this form, you shall become aware that I am not the word. In other words, this word is said to be the only word in the world which by its own substance and nature eliminates itself. When you see this word, you have seen that which has no boundaries, no dimensions, no beginning, no end, no middle.
which has neither substance nor essence, which has neither name nor sound. Therefore, the letters themselves consist of a series of statements negating themselves. The more you study the word, the more fascinating it becomes. You could write an essay on it, on the Hebrew letters. And most rabbinical scholars know very little about it, but a few who have been in the old school can do wonderful things with that word. They can combine its letters in many ways. They can make the very letters apart and put them together in other patterns. But no matter what you do with them, the word always distinguishes itself. It always ends up by saying, "Thou shalt make no likeness of me in this world or in the world to come. Thou shalt make no graven image upon paper, on stone, upon anything else, but the living God." So this word is a word that contradicts itself, and writes itself out. And in common parlance, it has been called boundless. It combines the boundless, the nameless, the soundless. It is the hymn of everlasting which rises up, saying, "If I name thee, I deny thee." So the word may be known or experienced only in the silence. It is the name which vanishes away when it is gone. There is reality. And the old scholar, the old Jewish rabbi said to his disciple, "My son, the hardest thing you will ever have to do is to rub out that one word. You can take away all other words, and that one will remain. You take that one away, you have attained the salvation of Israel." So these meditations and musings are something that we don't talk about much. I don't know very many students of the Kabbalah that know anything about it. And I wager you won't find this in books. But what is, which is the word which you will take away, comes in soul. Now, in soul is a combination of a word which must be removed and another word which can be allowed to remain. The word soul is derived from our same root as our word Sophia, and means wisdom. Ein Sof means the wisdom that cannot be possessed, the wisdom that even God does not have. Because, strangely enough, God is the only being that does good, because being perfect, he does not need wisdom, because wisdom is an attribute. In the Kabbalah, therefore, Ein Sof tells us a very interesting story. Ein being again, the word to be taken away, means wisdom. And wisdom is combined with this word to form a new term. And in the forming of this new term, Ein Sof, we have a strange contradiction. The contradiction of wisdom and that which cannot be or can never exist. This structure carries on to produce a third term, unsofair, which means the breath or the light of wisdom. And these three are together one third, formed into a triad. And when the triad is put together in the form of an equilateral triangle, a great number of words can be fashioned out of it by reading, beginning with one letter or word and passing to the next,
at different points of the triangle. Out of all these words comes the Kabbalistic concept, as they express it, of eternity. And to them, eternity is the complete statement of age, which is not there, plus supernea, which are there-ness and the revelation of there-ness. And these three are the Sefer Yetzira, the Sefer HaZohar, and the Sefer Apocalyptic, or the three great revelations. And these revelations concern and relate to the root which is unknown. Now, from this root in the Kabbalah, therefore, what are called, first of all, the Sephirah. And these Sephirah are the inverted plant with its root in cause and its branches and flowers in effect. There are two trees, one growing downward from reality, and the other growing upward from the heart of man. Bailey describes this class as the tree of the soul, which is planted in the heart and grows into the great palm tree of salvation. But in the Kabbalah, these two trees are due to the fact that there was a seed, the seed of life, planted in the great valley, and it took upon itself his life, and his life grew into the tree. And the two trees of the Sephirah meet in a strange and mysterious way and intermingle their branches by the 49 paths that tie together the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And the trees expand. And I have seen these trees expanded to their 12th fold. It is an incredible amount of detail. It means that thousands are of these trees. Each one marked and labeled and signifying its relationship both to the tree which grows from the root and the tree which grows from Adam, and what part of this tree overlaps the other. And one who corresponds to the institutional concept of influence and the other to age. One is the tree of life in the sense of the tree of the unfolding of the nameless, and the other is the tree of salvation, which is the redemption or regeneration of man. These trees are so detailed and the descriptions in them are so complicated that it's doubtful that one Jewish scholar in 10,000 can understand them. Because no longer these days old scholars read the words that their ancestors did. They gloss over it today at a couple of years of people in their theological studies. So as we say, this is all key also to two other things. As Rabbi Maimonides pointed out, the whole purpose of the Kabbalah is to fulfill the Torah, to build an absolute foundation of justification for the law, to make it obvious the law is the final proof of wisdom, not the wisdom of man, but the wisdom of Israel. And secondly, it is the second purpose of this great study is to show how, in this process of things, the salvation of Israel is to be assured. In other words, it is the consummation of the work in the prophetic place. Now, as I explained to you, this is only an outline, a very rough line, and not a particularly, perhaps intelligible one. But before we bring the evening to a close, and we're going to have to soon now, I just want to show you a little example or sample of how these things are worked in the ancient Jewish records. And so I have here our manuscript from our collection of part of the development of the Sefer HaZohar. And this is only a fragment. But a Jewish scientist to whom I showed it some time ago was very much interested in the study.
of certain parts of it. Because he said that part of this diagram relates to a physical problem which has plagued science for quite a long time, and that the answer to the problem is obviously here. And that has to do with the resistance of motion against the continuum of space. And I know that this manuscript was written long before those words were very significant in modern science. The manuscript which we have here, I cannot give you as complete a history of it as I would like to, because like many of these things, it passes through many hands and disappears. I'll tell you how I found it. I was at the British Museum one day. I didn't find it there, though. I noticed a little bookstore about a block from itself on an angle street leading into the front of the museum. And in the window there was a small reproduction in plaster of the head of the scene next to T.G. And I was a little intrigued, so I went in. I asked if he had any old books. He said he didn't think so, but there were a few things in the basement he hadn't looked at for a number of years. So we took the floorboards out and went down a ladder into the basement. And in one corner of the basement, wrapped up in newspapers, was a little stove. I suspect from the structure of it that it is probably Polish, and that its history, its date, probably 300 to 350 years old. This is reasonably old for this fighting. For a formal and technical credit, it is evidently from the same school as the translations of Norman Rosenblatt in his work on the Kabbalah Tekutaka. This is not the complete work. This is one scroll. And this particular scroll is concerned primarily with the Elohim, which means the mystery of the 50 breaths of God. In other words, the mystery of the breathing of the creating power. And that with each of these breathings, orders of life are energized. And this manuscript deals with which orders of life are energized by what breathings, and also with the mysterious breathings, by means of which bouquet, or the formal name for these beings, is breathed in and dissolved. So the work also contains the fact that we outbreathe the symbols of things, and in our inbreathing we remove the symbol or dissolve it again. And the symbol passes through our heart, and there it ceases as the blood is purified. It is an amazing document, but it will give you some concept of the way in which these things were worked out. Now this is all written upon parchment that has been specially prepared. The pieces are fastened together with thin strips of parchment, because no thread, string, or cord is permitted according to the law or the Torah. These manuscripts unfold the mystery of the universe. And here is part of the development of the aim and the aim sought, and its extension through the first three spheres, which are the spheres of Abba, Ema, and Dea. And of all the mysteries of the Kabbalah, one of the greatest mysteries is Dea, which is not, however, a synonym of death, as you might at first think, because Dea is the first manifestation of aim in the field of creation, because Dea is the being that is no being on the level of creation. That which is but is not. That which exists but cannot be named. And that toward which all named things flow to form the nameless. And this principle of Dea, as it appears in the Kabbalah, is set always here in the form of a cross. So here are the paths of the letters, the 49 gates through which Moses passed, and through which also Solomon passed, but where he was forced to stand and wait for the Messiah who would pass through the 50th gate. So this will give you a little
idea of how these philosophies were developed. And here is a legitimate example. And we hope, it's a serious hope of ours, that one of these days we will be able to translate and publish the entire scroll with its commentaries from the Kabbalah de Enoch. Because I think it would give us something that would help us a lot. Perhaps it would all answer all the questions of the universe. Perhaps it wouldn't make us eternally wise. Perhaps it would, however, give us a little bit better understanding of people that has wandered far along, has gone through some very strange and terrible things, and has developed a great many pressures as a result of experiences in the past. Perhaps an understanding of these things would advance the brotherhood of peoples by helping us to realize that in the secret doctrine of Israel we have a very great and noble concept, that it might be a wonderful thing if more Jewish people understood that and found thereby not only the true keys of their own religion, but a greater and deeper understanding which would enable them to find and experience the love of Israel among all men, among all people under the sun. I think this heritage would be important to be known. And in that I am not differing very much from the late Professor Einstein, who on one occasion said that one of the most important things that the Jews would ever do is to understand the Kabbalah. And that in that you will not only find a great knowledge, but most of all, he would find the center of his religion, the secret book. And that is the book of the great peace, which would put his heart to rest. And so that's all that would be.